David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, Chapter 25, Good and Bad Angels. I was going out at my door after a deplorable day of headache, sickness, and repentance when I saw a ticket porter coming upstairs with a letter in his hand. He was taking his time about his errand there, but when he saw me on the top of the staircase looking at him over the banisters, he swung into a trot and came up panting, as if he had run himself into a state of exhaustion. "T. Copperfield, Esquire," said the ticket porter, touching his hat with his little cane. I could scarcely lay claim to the name. I was so disturbed by the conviction that the letter came from Agnes. However, I told him I was T. Copperfield, Esquire, and he believed it, and gave me the letter, which he said required an answer. I shut him out on the landing and went into my chambers again. It was a very kind note, containing no reference to my condition at the theatre. All it said was, "My dear Trotwood, I am staying at the house of Papa's agent, Mr. Waterbrook, at Ely Place, Holborn. Will you come and see me today, at any time you like to appoint? Yours affectionately, Agnes." It took me a long time to write an answer at all to my satisfaction, that I don't know what the ticket porter can have thought, unless he thought I was learning to write. I must have written a half-dozen answers at least. I began one, "How can I ever hope, my dear Agnes, to efface from your remembrance the disgusting impression that..." There, I didn't like it, and then I tore it up. I began another, "Shakespeare has observed, my dear Agnes, how strange it is that a man should put an enemy into his mouth." That reminded me of Markham, and it got no further. I even tried poetry. I began one note in a 6-syllable line, "Oh, do not remember," but that associated itself with the 5th of November and became an absurdity. After many attempts, I wrote, "Dear Agnes, your letter is like you." And what could I say of it that would be of higher praise than that? I will come at 4 o'clock. Affectionately and sorrowfully, T.C. With this missive, which I was in 20 minds at once about recalling as soon as it was out of my hand, the ticket porter at last departed. Although I left the office at 3:30 and was prowling about the place of appointment within a few minutes afterwards, the appointed time was exceeded by a full quarter of an hour, according to the clock of St. Andrew's, Holborn, before I could muster up sufficient desperation to pull the private bell handle let into the left-hand doorpost of Mr. Waterbrook's house. I was shown into a pretty but rather close drawing-room, and there sat Agnes, netting a purse. She looked so quiet and so good, and reminded me so strongly of my airy, fresh school days at Canterbury, and the sodden, smoky, stupid wretch I had been the other night, that nobody being by, I yielded to my self-reproach and shame, and, in short, made a fool of myself. I cannot deny that I shed tears. To this hour I am undecided whether it was, upon the whole, the wisest thing I could have done, or the most ridiculous. "If it had been anyone but you, Agnes," said I, turning away my head, "I should not have minded it half so much. But that it should have been you who saw me, I almost wish I had been dead first." She put her hand, its touch was like no other hand, upon my arm for a moment, and I felt so befriended and comforted that I could not help moving it to my lips and gratefully kissing it. "Sit down," said Agnes cheerfully. "Don't be unhappy, Trotwood. If you cannot confidentially trust me, whom will you trust?" "Ah, Agnes," I returned, "you are my good angel." She smiled rather sadly, I thought, and shook her head. "Yes, Agnes, my good angel. Always my good angel." "If I were indeed Trotwood," she returned, "there is one thing that I should set my heart on very much." I looked at her inquiringly, but already with a foreknowledge of her meaning. "On warning you," said Agnes, with a steady glance, "against your bad angel." "My dear Agnes," I began, "if you mean Steerforth—" "I do, Trotwood," she returned. "Then, Agnes, you wrong him very much. He my bad angel or anyone's? He anything but a guide, a support, and a friend to me? My dear Agnes, now it is not unjust and unlike you. Now, is it not unjust and unlike you to judge him from what you saw of me the other night?" "I do not judge him from what I saw of you the other night," she quietly replied. "I judge him partly from your account of him, Trotwood, and your character, and the influence he has on you. There was always something in her modest voice that seemed to touch a chord within me answering to that sound alone. It was always earnest, but when it was very earnest, as it was now, there was a thrill in it that quite subdued me. I sat looking at her as she cast her eyes down on her work. I am not so unreasonable as to expect, said Agnes, resuming her usual tone after a little while, that you will, or that you can, at once, change any sentiment that has become a conviction to you. I only ask you, Trotwood, to think of what I have said. Do you forgive me for all this? I will forgive you, Agnes, I replied, when you come to do Steerforth justice, and to like him as well as I do. Not until then, said Agnes. I saw a passing shadow on her face, but she returned my smile, and we were again unreserved in our mutual confidence of old. And when, Agnes, said I, will you forgive me the other night? When I recall it, said Agnes. She dismissed the subject so calmly, changing the conversation. She asked me if I had seen Uriah Heep. Uriah Heep, said I. No, is he in London? He comes to the office downstairs every day, returned Agnes. He was in London a week before me. I am afraid on disagreeable business, Trotwood. On some business that makes you uneasy, Agnes, I see, said I. What can that be? Agnes laid aside her work and replied, folding her hands upon one another and looking pensively at me out of those beautiful soft eyes of hers. I believe he is going to enter into partnership with Papa. What, Uriah? That mean, fawning fellow worm himself under such promotion? I cried indignantly. Have you made no remonstrance about it, Agnes? You must not allow your father to take such a mad step. Still looking at me, Agnes shook her head while I was speaking, with a faint smile at my warmth, and then replied, You remember our last conversation about Papa? It was not long after that, not more than 2 or 3 days, when he gave me the first intimation of what I tell you. It was sad to see him struggling between his desire to represent it to me as a matter of choice on his part, and his inability to conceal that it was forced upon him. I felt very sorry. Forced upon him, Agnes? Who forces it upon him? Uriah, she replied after a moment's hesitation, has made himself indispensable to Papa. He is subtle and watchful. He has mastered Papa's weaknesses, fostered them, and taken advantage of them until, to say all that I mean in a word, Trotwood, until Papa is afraid of him. There was more that she might have said, more that she knew, or that she suspected, I clearly saw. I could not give her pain by asking her what it was, for I knew that she withheld it from me to spare her father. It had long been going on, this. I was sensible, yes. I could not feel on the last reflection that it had been going on to this for a long time. I remained silent. His ascendancy over Papa, said Agnes, is very great. He professes humility and gratitude with truth. Perhaps I hope so, but his position is really one of power, and I fear he makes a hard use of his power. I said he was a hound, which at the moment was a great satisfaction to me. We are not likely to remain alone much longer, said Agnes, and while I have the opportunity, let me earnestly entreat you, Trotwood, to be friendly to Uriah. Don't repel him. Don't resent, as I think you have a great disposition to do, what may be uncongenial to you in him. He may not deserve it. For all we know, no certain ill of him. In any case, think first of Papa and me. Agnes had no time to say more, for the room door opened, and Mrs. Waterbrook, who was a large lady, or who wore a large dress, I don't exactly know which, for I don't know which was dress and which was lady, came sailing in. I had a dim recollection of having seen her at the theatre, and if I had seen her in the pale magic lantern, as if I had seen her in a pale magic lantern, but she appeared to remember me perfectly, and still to suspect me of being in a state of intoxication, Finding by degrees, however, that I was sober, and I hope that I was a modest young gentleman, Mrs. Waterbrook softened toward me considerably, and inquired, firstly, if I went much into the parks, and secondly, if I went much into society. On my replying to both these questions in the negative, it occurred to me that I fell again in her good opinion. But she concealed the fact gracefully and invited me to dinner the next day. I accepted the invitation and took my leave. I went to dinner next day, and on the street door being opened, plunged into a vapor bath of haunch of mutton. I found Mr. Waterbrook to be a middle-aged gentleman with a short throat and a good deal of shirt collar, who only wanted a black nose to be the portrait of a pug dog. He presented me with much ceremony to a very awful lady in a black velvet dress and a great black velvet hat, which I remember as looking like near a relation as Hamlet's, say, his aunt. Mrs. Henry Spiker was this lady's name, and her husband was there too, so cold a man that his head, instead of being gray, seemed to be sprinkled with hoarfrost. Immense deference was shown to the Henry Spikers, male and female, which Agnes told me was on account of Mr. Henry Spiker being solicitor to something or to somebody. I forgot what or which, remotely connected with the Treasury. I found Uriah Heep among the company, in a suit of black, and in deep humility. He told me when I shook hands with him that he was proud to have noticed me, and that he really felt obliged to me for my condescension. I could have wished he had been less obliged with me, for he hovered about me in his gratitude all the rest of the evening, and whenever I had I said a word to Agnes, was sure, with his shadowless eyes and cadaverous face, to be looking gauntly down upon us from behind. There were other guests, all iced for the occasion, as it struck me like the wine, but there was one who attracted my attention before he came in, on account of my hearing him announced as Mr. Traddles. My mind flew back to Salem House. And could it be Tommy, I thought, who used to draw the skeletons? I looked at Mr. Traddles with unusual interest. He was a sober, steady-looking young man of retiring manners, with a comic head of hair and eyes that were rather wide open. And he got into an obscure corner so soon that I had some difficulty in making him out. At length I had a good view of him, and either my vision deceived me, or it was the unfortunate Tommy. I made my way to Mr. Waterbrook, and said that I believed I had the pleasure of seeing an old schoolfellow there. "Indeed," said Mr. Waterbrook, surprised. "You are too young to have been at school with Mr. Henry Spiker." "Oh, I don't mean him," I returned. "I mean the gentleman named Traddles." "Oh, aye, indeed," said my host, with very much diminished interest. "Possibly." I inquired what Mr. Traddles was by profession. "Traddles," returned Mr. Waterbrook, "is a young man reading for the bar. Yes, he is quite a good fellow. Nobody's enemy but his own." "Is he his own enemy?" I said. Said I, sorry to hear this. "Well," returned Mr. Waterbrook, pursing his mouth and playing with his watch chain in a comfortable, prosperous sort of way, "I should say he was one of those men who stand in their own light. Yes, I should say he would never, for example, be worth £500. Traddles was recommended to me by a professional friend. Oh, yes." When dinner was announced, Mr. Waterbrook went down again with Hamlet's aunt. Mr. Henry Spiker took Mrs. Waterbrook. Agnes, whom I should have liked to take myself, was given to a simpering fellow with weak legs. Uriah, Traddles, and I, as the junior part of the company, went down last. How we could. The dinner was very long, and the conversation was about the aristocracy and blood. Mrs. Waterbrook repeatedly told us, if she had a weakness, it was blood. We might have been a party of ogres, the conversation assumed such sanguine complexion, and we will pause there.